Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. Today it is season 10, episode number 7. And I want to welcome you to the program. Every once in a while, a new author comes out and their narrative voice really takes you by surprise and captivates you. Writing is something that is so individual, but there's a lot of writers hard into it. It's, not automatic science. We work hard to make it very, very distinct. That individuality is what sets all the writing apart. It's why we don't like every author. We like some over others. When you get great storytelling, what makes the characters in the work leap out and take you by hold of mind, it's really something. Likewise, nonfiction and biographies have often been avoided by many people. They think they're staid and boring. Lately, authors like Eric Larson and many others have worked to make biographical, historical, and archival work really come alive, really captivate you. Writers like today's guest, Sarah Neidhardt, take people who don't know the people that she's speaking of and makes them come alive for us in their minds as though we know them in real life, and makes us want to know more about the book once we put it down. Like I did, I felt this way about her book when I was done with it. It's a real gift, and I really applaud this when I read something like this. My guest, Sarah Neidhardt, has worked as a bookseller, secretary, paralegal, copy editor, and stay-at-home mother. She grew up in Arkansas and Northern California and now lives in Portland, Oregon, with her husband and teenage son. She's a graduate of Oberlin College, and her new book is called 20 Acres, A 70s Childhood in the Woods, and it is out right now. I want to recommend this book highly to you. I'm going to have links to it in the bio, but I don't want to dither on anymore. I want to just take you right to my conversation with Sarah Neidhardt. Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. Today, I'm very happy to be talking to author Sarah Neidhardt, who has worked as a bookseller, secretary, paralegal, copy editor, and stay-at-home mother. She grew up in Arkansas in Northern California and now lives in Portland, Oregon, with her husband and teenage son. She's a graduate of Oberlin College. Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You've written a book called 20 Acres, A 70s Childhood in the Woods, published by University of Arkansas Press. The book is a memoir of being a child in a family cabin in Arkansas during the 1970s. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about this book and why you wrote it?
Well, it's about my 1970s back to the land childhood in the Arkansas Ozarks. It is based, sort of the spine of the book is formed by a large collection of letters that my mother wrote at the time, a few other people also, but mostly my mother. Letters that my grandmother kept, and also some transcriptions of audio cassettes that we made at the time. So it's sort of got this archival material padded with memory that forms the spine of it. And that's kind of what really drove me to write it. And it's about this, very particular era in American culture, the late 60s into the 70s, when the counterculture was making a really big impact on certain segments of America and mainstream America to some extent as well. It's about family life in a harsh environment. It's about culture clash, sort of red versus blue in modern terms. And it's about Arkansas and life in a marginalized place. I sort of think of it as Little House on the Prairie meets Dolly Parton meets Whole Earth Catalog. It's kind of got a little of all of that going on there.
Now, a disclosure, Sarah and I used to work together at Walden Books bookstore back in the 90s. And I remember you were a great bookseller. You really knew a lot about books and seemed to really love them. What's it like for you now to be a published author? You're on the opposite side of that. You're actually having your own book come out. What is that like for you?
It's probably an overused word, but it's completely surreal. It's kind of hard to believe, really, because I have loved books since I was a child. I've been around bookstores off and on since I was a child. And to make my own book really is sort of astonishing to me still. Doesn't really feel quite real.
Now, I remember you telling stories about your time as a child living in Arkansas with your parents. Some of them stuck with me over the years. When did you decide to write the book about your parents' life living in Arkansas in the 70s?
I didn't really, I'd always, starting in about my 20s, I was kind of constantly writing little notes to myself about it. Like I just felt like I had to remember some of this stuff. But it wasn't until about the time my son went into kindergarten, which was about 2012, 2013, that I started looking through all these letters that my mother had at her house. And got them all out, organized them, put them in sequential order, and transcribed them. And that's when I really encountered a real story. Like there was a story arc. It was beyond just anecdotes. And that's when I decided I have to put this whole, I'm going to write a whole story. I'm going to write the whole story, start to finish.
Before your parents lived in Arkansas, they lived in Colorado. How did your parents come to know about Arkansas and get there in the first place?
Well, when they were living in Colorado, about a year after they married, young leather worker named Larry came to Colorado Springs in the summer of 1972 from Fox, Arkansas. He and Daddy then met through some mutual friends at a leather shop in downtown Colorado Springs. And they got to talking and drinking and that sort of thing. And Larry went on and on about the glories of the Arkansas Ozarks. And Daddy was already starting to think about going back to the land at this point. And he'd looked at some land in southern Colorado, which was all he could afford in Colorado, but it was kind of dry and grim. So just by happenstance, Larry's car was stolen a few days later, and he had no way to get back to Arkansas. So my dad and a climbing friend of his, this man named Ray Connor is his pseudonym, so I won't say his real name, but he and Ray and me and my mom, we drove Larry home in the summer of 1972. And that was when we discovered Arkansas. Daddy didn't really know it. Daddy grew up in South Carolina. He'd heard of Arkansas, but he just kind of thought of it as hillbilly country. So this was new to him.
I grew up when I was young. I'm old enough to remember like the Mad Men era and that time period and how everything was kind of prefab. Food was largely Jello and cheese in a can, things like that. Then there was this huge shift suddenly when people wanted to get back to the land. Gardening was suddenly huge. Living in rural areas was suddenly huge. Making your own knowledge about how to make food and learning about how the things that our forebears did was really popular. I think the Little House on the Prairie books were popular.
Totally.
There's lots of movies coming out and stuff like that. Can you talk about that a little bit, about that movement for the people that are like maybe too young to remember it?
Yeah. I mean, what I find really interesting is that society now is such a good time to use as a comparison, because from what I've read and understand, society and life in 60s, 70s really felt a lot like it does right now. There was so much global unrest, global social unrest, war. We had the Vietnam War. 70s had terrible inflation. There was gas shortages, police killings, corrupt politicians. The fear for the future of the planet was, the environmentalism was a huge movement at that time. We didn't invent that movement in, the past 20 years. This was really being written about and thought about all the time. And so people really felt that sort of kind of catastrophic, apocalyptic feeling that I think a lot of people feel now. And also you had the folk music scene had been going on for quite some time, at least throughout the entire 60s. And that was really influencing popular culture and the counterculture, which of course, folk music sort of glorified the rural. And I think all those things were sort of coming together. It was just such a social revolution in so many ways.
I really love that you mentioned some works and how books were really influencing this time period. I had forgotten about, but I've seen over the years books like 5 Acres and Independence by Keynes, Stalking the Wild Asparagus by the then very famous Yule Gibbons, and the Whole Earth catalog, which was huge. Did you go back and read some of these works to get an idea of what it must have been like to be an adult during this time, doing your research?
I didn't read them extensively, but I definitely went through them and I bought copies of all of them for myself. My parents' copies didn't exist anymore. And I definitely looked through them for that very reason, to sort of get a feel of what they were like and what my parents and people like them would have been reading. And it was actually looking through them that I discovered where my parents had gotten some of their ideas. For instance, I realized that Yule Gibbons had given us the idea to make sumac juice in a washing machine, which, is stories that I've told a million times throughout my life. And that came straight out of Yule Gibbons. And I think my parents got the scrapple we ate was out of one of the Foxfire books, is pretty clear to me. And so, yeah, I sort of sort of fetishize those books now. Stalking the Wild Asparagus is like the best book title ever. So I bought that in like 3 different copies because I just love it. So yeah, I have definitely dipped into them.
I think a lot of people now aren't really sure how it came that people were basically going back to live off the land. But you talk about your father and how his experience during this time period. And I think we forget that it was a very large, we were talking about race issues that were at the forefront. The economy had changed. The life that my grandfather may have had was very different than what my dad would have experienced. The economy changed largely. People, I think, were very insecure. What was he going through during this time period?
Well, when I've talked to him about it, he's not truly in touch with the idea that the sort of chaos of that time fueled this desire to go back to the land. He sort of thinks of it more as his love of nature, but there is no doubt that it must have had. It is what led to the whole movement itself, and there's no doubt that he himself had been through a lot in the 60s. He had a very difficult relationship with his family. They were very conservative Southerners. He grew up in Columbia, South Carolina. He had been involved in the civil rights movement in Columbia and dealt with he'd had a pretty scary interaction with a Ku Klux Klan recruiter in Columbia.
Yikes.
And he, that was very stressful. And then he got caught up in the drug world, which had its own sort of stress. And then Vietnam came and he was, drafted and thank goodness he didn't make it to the front lines, but it was a scary time waiting to hear if that was going to happen. And that whole thing was disturbing and stressful. And then he got a divorce from his first wife. So it was an intense time. So there's no doubt that he was feeling it. It was hard for anyone not to have be impacted in some way from all the turmoil in society.
I loved your writing about your mother in the book, and I really don't want to paint her as some like person that was just like blithely going off to do this. She had some adventures of her own, and she had an impetus to go make sure that this happened to kind of help your father live his dreams and make it her dream as well. What was this like for your mother going into this?
It was not her choice to do this, and she did not want to do it. So she wasn't really supportive of my father's dream. She was more annoyed by my father's dream, but and maybe more submissive because she was very young. She was 25. She loved my dad. She had me already. She was pregnant with my sister already. So, she was committed to this process, committed to the marriage. So, and my father was determined, he was young. He also was 28 and headstrong, and this is what he was going to do. So I don't think she had it in her at that time to put her foot down and say, no, we have to think of something. Let's find a compromise. That just wasn't in her vocabulary at that time. But I also discovered writing the book that there was some willingness there, and that she too was breathing some of that same counterculture air, and she did not want, her letters made clear she had written quite a few letters to her parents before my parents were married. She had gone off to live in Boston for a time, sort of trying to make a life there, and and she went to France for a time, so there were some letters to her parents, and it was very clear from those that she really wanted a life that wasn't sort of the typical bourgeois life, and she wanted something out of the ordinary. When she was in Boston, she's always talking of the mountains and the mountains and the mountains, missing the mountains in Colorado and needing to find a place to live and a life that wasn't 9-to-5 boredom. So yeah, she was part, it wasn't like this was just completely foreign to her, this idea.
I love that you mentioned the Wilderness Family movies in the book, because that was a hugely popular film at the time. Like, we may not remember it now, but it was huge. It was really big. And I know that like we had the Waltons on TV and Little House on the Prairie, and they had a lot of people happily living off the land. Can you talk about this a little bit and how it may have influenced the modern consciousness?
Yeah, it's so weird because I had no idea going into writing this book how popular the idea had been. We were pretty isolated from the larger counterculture, by moving to Arkansas and then kind of other non-counterculture type places that followed after that. I kind of missed all this. And so I felt almost a little embarrassed when I was writing the book to realize what a cliche my family was. I sort of thought this was this super unusual thing. And it's like, oh no, this is so cliche. But then I discovered while I was writing The Wilderness Family, which kind of blew me away. And I just last month discovered a BBC show from 1975 called The Good Life, which is about a suburban couple in England who decide to do all this back to the land stuff, but at their house in suburbia. But it's a direct comment on this movement right in the moment. And then there was Green Acres, which I never even thought about. I watched that runs as a child, and I never thought about that as a back to the land show, but it absolutely is. And then, of course, Little House on the Prairie wasn't back to the land, but it was a sort of precursor to that idea. And the Waltons, of course, too. And then, kind of embarrassingly, I just last year discovered John Prine's song Spanish Pipe Dream, which was written in, I think, 1971. And it's, blow up your TV, throw away your paper, go to the country, build you a home, plant a little garden. It's the back to the land movement in song right at that moment. And I'm sure there are many others that I am forgetting or that I haven't discovered yet. So it was a counterculture movement that the mainstream was watching pretty closely. I mean, it was being talked about regularly. It was everywhere.
I'm very excited that you have an excerpt from the book to read for us. Can you go ahead and read that?
Yeah, it's just a short one, but this is from a chapter primarily on the food, which was a big part of living off the land. Our first Thanksgiving on the land in 1974 had not included the sterling silver and turkey and creamed onions and crescent rolls we would enjoy later. Instead, Mama had written, "We are to have a goat roast for Thanksgiving. One of our goats will be butchered and barbecued outside. Many are invited, but I don't know how many will come." Although we had numerous goat roasts through the years, Mama told me, "I have only one memory of Richard killing the goat before he butchered it. He had a pistol and shot it in the head." She and Katie and I held each other in the cabin as the human cry of the goat rang out and then stopped. It was a good lesson for us, she felt, that meat involves killing, and it did not dampen our appetites. Our youngest cousin, David, was 8, new to the country, and wearing white when he first experienced a goat roast. He walked around a corner just as Daddy ripped the knife down the goat's gut, and some of the butchering blood got on his clothes. He threw up on his shoes. A few hours later, we were all sitting in front of the cabin, gnawing on the dead animal. Only Daddy developed a lasting taste for goat. He still appreciates a meal where all parts of the beast are on offer. He wants to taste the animal's musk in his bite. But this is partly a trait of nature rather than nurture, and years of goat and wild animal meat did not inure me to the flavor. The goat's musky fat gives its meat and milk a flavor that to me tastes like a goat smells, or worse, like the rank stink of a rattlesnake. And that's the end of that reading.
Thank you. This episode is sponsored by Culinary Historians of Northern California, a Bay Area educational group dedicated to the study of food, drink, and culture in human history. To learn more about this organization and their work, please visit their website at www.chnorcal.org. I see on Instagram a lot of, and like TikTok and things like that, a lot of references to people, basically, oh, all you have to do is just put a little cabin on the land and you'll be fine and everything's going to be great.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a lot of the sentimentality that's kind of going back to living off the land and living, somewhere kind of off the grid. What do you think of all this now, having done it yourself as a young person? Do you think it's kind of like, wishful thinking, or do you think it's kind of like, does it sound fanciful still after all this time?
You know, if I'm really honest, because I feel bad about this, my initial reaction is to be very put off by it. But that's totally unfair. I don't think there's any reason to be put off by it. I think that it's about sustainability and organic foods and sort of looking at a new way to approach the future. And I think there's nothing but good in that. And if this generation's movement is as impactful as my parents was, which led to so many things that are mainstream now, like organic foods and whole wheat bread and yogurt and, you know, things we take for granted. So if theirs is as impactful, then it's good for the planet. And they also, this generation's back to the landers seem to be going about things more carefully and responsibly, and they have the internet to keep them connected and working no matter where they are. So I think that it is good. You know, I also, there's still a part of me, one, it's still a pretty elite movement. And when I say elite, I guess sort of a privileged movement is a better word, just that, you know, to be able to do this, while there are exceptions, but to be able to do this largely takes being a person who can choose to check out. That doesn't mean being fabulously wealthy, but just sort of growing up with that sense that that's something you can do, which is certainly not how a lot of people grow up. And I think the movement is still the same. So it's hard to know how really, you know, where will it take us when it's not something that can be sort of replicated. But, you know, we get new ideas from it. So I think it's good. I think it's good.
I love the picture that you paint of your parents as real human beings. You really go to great pains to make them be very three-dimensional. And I love that they weren't, you know, anybody who would be listening to this and may have seen other accounts of people living in communes during this time period, you know, they weren't, whether or not they thought of themselves as hippies, they weren't the stereotypical hippie. They're both very well educated, very accomplished people. Your father, in my mind, is a bit of a badass. He did all these things. You know, he's, you know, I thought he's pretty amazing, and your mother as well is pretty amazing. So, what did you think in writing them? Was it hard to kind of I mean, it must be easy for you as their child to make them seem real, as opposed to somebody who'd be writing from the outside. But
Right.
did you want to take great pains to make sure you people didn't think they were like some, you know, commune hippies just saying far out, man, you know, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't too hard because they so clearly weren't. But at the same time, yeah, I grew up very much with that sense that they were not hippies. These were hippies. You know, hippies have, you know, are in the drug scene and they join communes and they totally want to check out. And they're more into sort of mysticism and overt romanticism, which is just none of that fits my parents. My dad
Yeah.
definitely was a bit of a hippie when my mom met him, but not full bore. And I, so yeah, I did sort of want to make that distinction. And I think it's kind of now, yeah, probably similar to now, people wanting not to be considered hipsters in the true sense of what a hipster, you know, the full hipster dress and mannerisms, but really to the average American outside of an urban area, they're probably seen as hipsters, which I think is how my parents would have definitely been seen as hippies by the local Arkansans, but not maybe by the full on hippie scene. Um, but it and as far as making my parents, you know, getting to the real crux of who they were, it in some ways, once I got writing, it became easier and easier because I had these little like light bulb moments, partly from just being a human myself and an adult. You know, I'm an adult now too, and I'm so much older than they were then, so I've been through those stages of life. And so I think part of it was I was able, when I read things and sort of put it all together, I was able to see like, oh, well, this is probably why this happened. And then I could talk it through with them. And I think it was a hugely cathartic experience for them, actually, to sort of be seen from that emotional standpoint, you know, both of them sort of like, well, yeah, that's how I felt, you know, that's why, you know, I think it was, yeah.
You've been able to go through so much of your family's history, from letters to tape recordings to photographs. I mean, you've been through like a wealth of material. How long did it take you to assemble enough of it for a book length manuscript?
The letters, you know, probably only took me a few months to transcribe and then maybe a few more to transcribe the tapes. So the actual sort of pulling it together was pretty quick, but it took 7 or 8 years to pull that all together into a book, to sort of edit it and chop it and copy and paste and move and shape. And that took a long time. Yeah.
I want to ask you, as somebody who's had privy to really intimate letters and even like wonderful love poems and things, how did this change your insight of your parents?
Well, I saw this side of my dad that I didn't know about really from his adult life, where he, his 27-year-old self, 26-year-old self, when he was before my parents married, and he was writing her love letters. He was so sort of like a teenage girl. I mean, that's unfair, but that's how I saw it, because it was so much like my own diary entries, just very moody and very, romantic, and creating a little nest at his house and buying little things to decorate. So that was kind of like jaw-dropping to me. And I think I also saw through the letters how much more my mom really was sort of enjoying the process. I saw the parts of it that she enjoyed, and how she was buying into a lot of it too. Sometimes it wasn't clear to me whether it was propaganda for her parents' sake, because obviously her mother wasn't thrilled about this whole thing, and how much was her own buy-in. But there was definitely some real feelings of pride in those letters that she had. I also was really surprised. I discovered in the letters, again, before my parents were married, letters that my mother wrote to her parents, that she had gotten into UC Berkeley for grad school and had completely planned to go, and was going to save up money to go just 6 months or so before she married my dad. And that was kind of a complete shock, because it had never come up. It's a pretty big plan, and to just pivot like that so suddenly was really surprising. But I think the greatest insight from the letters, just sort of the whole process maybe, was that the woods, I had always thought this period of our family life in the woods was what eroded my parents' marriage and sort of led to so much strife in their marriage. But I actually think that their marriage was incredibly difficult the first 2 years before we moved to the woods, and that the woods probably saved their marriage. The sort of, you know, hard work and togetherness that led to problems, but it also kept them working towards a common goal. And that it was probably more the life after the woods, when mama had to also get a job to make ends meet, and they were both working outside the home, and 3 kids, and just sort of joining the rat race. And that's really what was really hard.
I didn't write this question down, but I've just been thinking of it as you've been talking. What do your parents think of this book?
They love it. They are so excited. My parents are just incredibly open, sort of honest people, very, very unsentimental, although my dad in particular is quite sentimental about this book, I think. But they're very comfortable with all of it. But they also, it makes them feel really good, because this was, potentially could be considered a mistake that they made in their lives, sort of like and it has had financial impacts on them their whole lives. So to have this impact on me, on the impact that it's had on me, and the fact that it's now a book and it's going out in the world and it's going to be part of history. Yeah, they're thrilled.
I guess I really didn't think about this too, but I mean, you'll be able to have this record of your family for like your son and then his children,
Yeah.
etc. Like that must be kind of amazing to be able to offer that for your family. What do your other family members think of the book?
My sisters are absolutely thrilled. My Aunt Sarah and my Uncle Jock, who are both in the book, are absolutely thrilled. I'll be interested. My mother's extended family, who are so, had such a very different life than ours, that was always very much in juxtaposition to ours in my mind growing up. It'll be interesting to me to hear what they think about it, because I think mama was seen as having sort of gone off and done this wild, crazy thing, and we were sort of the poor relations. So I think part of me wants them to see, look, this was a movement. This was, this is historically significant. It wasn't just some crackpot, flailing in the dark thing that my parents did. So I think I think there's a part of me that wants them to see that.
Now, you didn't just interview your parents about the book or you talked to a lot of different relatives about the book. Did this create stronger connections with you and other relatives? Did this change things in the family a little bit?
It did create stronger relationships. I feel closer again to my three cousins, who my dad's sister eventually moved out to the woods too in 1978, after divorcing, and brought her three boys with her. And they were ages 8 to 15, which is hard to even imagine from suburban North Carolina. They came out to the woods. And our relationship at the time was, not easy. We were younger. They were boys. They were
Yeah.
had been through sort of a traumatic situation. So it was kind of a stressful situation for them. And they weren't always the nicest cousins at that time. But
Yeah.
reconnected with them. And we also lived in different parts of the country as we grew older. And so we just kind of naturally grew apart from them. But interviewing them, particularly my cousin Dave, who I talked to the most, it definitely made me feel closer to him. And I got some insight into their lives there, which was really interesting that I didn't know. And yeah, definitely that's been nice.
Now, you're going to be going back to the cabin this Memorial Day with both your parents and your husband and son. I can imagine this must be very exciting for you. How do you feel about coming back to this place and making a full circle?
I am so excited and incredibly nervous. It's so weird how nervous I am. I just feel this kind of discombobulated feeling. I think it's been such a mythical place for so long. And when we left in 1981, I never saw it again. We moved like an hour away, but then we moved to Little Rock, and then we moved to California in 1986. And I went back to Arkansas one time in 1999. I went on a business trip, strangely enough, with a company I was working for in California, and we had to go to Fayetteville. And so I was in Fayetteville for like 3 days. That's the only time I've been in Arkansas since 1986. I have not been back to the cabin. So it just feels huge. And I think I'm a little afraid that the myth will be the bubble will be burst. I'm a little afraid to crack that sort of mythical place. And, we were also outsiders there. I felt very welcome in the woods. There were no issues in the woods time in Arkansas, but I think there's also a little bit of a trepidation, that sort of outsider feeling. So I feel, but mostly I'm just really excited. It just feels momentous. And the Mountain View has something called the Ozark Folk Center, which was started in 1973, the year that we moved to Arkansas, to Stone County. And it's celebrating its 50th anniversary on Memorial Day weekend. So it's going to be this really neat thing. I turned 51 this year. It's their 50th anniversary. It's the 50th anniversary of our move there. So it feels like a very special time to be there.
You recently got the books in a box, the first copies of it. What was it like to hold this in your hand and kind of page through it?
It was cool. It was really cool. I mean, again, to be honest, it was also slightly anticlimactic because it had been such a long journey and such a slow slog to kind of get it in bound paper. And so again, I was a little numb once it was in my hand. But as the days have gone by, I find myself sort of stopping every now and then to look at it sitting on a couch or the table and kind of stare at it from different angles, or I feel drawn to sort of open it off and on and read little bits to kind of be reminded what others are reading and seeing. So yeah, it's very cool. It's definitely cool.
It must be surreal to think that this will appear in bookstores and be in libraries.
Yeah, yes, it is. It's still sort of hard to imagine, for all the reasons that writing a book and having it out in the world, first book, feels amazing. And then when it's such a personal story, yeah, even more so.
So, Sarah, what's next for you?
Well, I am working and have been maybe for about a year now, working on another book that mines my family archive. In addition to these letters of my parents from the 60s and 70s, I also have spent the last 5 years or so transcribing hundreds and hundreds of letters that my family wrote from the 1840s to the 1980s. pretty much one female of each generation in my family has kept all of their letters and some of their children's letters. And so it's a massive amount. And I've gotten family members to ship what they had to me. So I've got tons of them. And I've since printed books of those transcriptions for the family and then sent all the originals onto the Schlesinger Library at Harvard for safekeeping. And so I'm building a book now, sort of out of this archive, about my great Aunt Ruth. She's also in 20 Acres, actually.
Yeah.
But she was a well-known child psychologist, and she spent her life with a woman who was an archaeologist. And it's a story of an interesting slice of life from first wave feminism. They would never have considered themselves lesbians or feminists, but that story is there, and it's a really fascinating story. So I'm building that.
That sounds wonderful. I'm very excited to read this one too. Sarah, I want to thank you for being on the podcast. I really enjoy getting a chance to talk to you again, and I love the book. I want to encourage people to read it. They're going to love it too. We're going to put links to it in the bio so they can check it out there.
Thank you, Dean.
That was my conversation with Sarah Neidhardt. Her book, 20 Acres, is out now. You can get it on all major distributors. You can also purchase it at all better bookstores. We have a link to it in the bio. I want to thank you for listening to the podcast today. I am continually thrilled to be able to do this, and it is something that I love so much. To be at season 10, episode 7 is just a joy to me, and I look at the many people that I've interviewed over time, and I am just gobsmacked that I've been this lucky to be able to talk to so many wonderful authors like today's guest. And I just thank you, the listener. I'm so grateful to you, and just very touched that you take the time to listen to this podcast. Until next week, I hope you're having a wonderful week, and that maybe you're cooking something from one of the authors on the program, or maybe you're reading one of the books by somebody that I recommended to you. Until next week, keep on cooking.